Good morning, good afternoon to all of you, and thank you so much for joining. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes so that we can let our fellow participants join. So just hang around for a sec and we'll be with you in a moment. Oh, and please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. It'll be great to see all of you and where you're from. Great to see so many of you. Hi, Dorothy. Hi, Salome. Hi, Camilla. And hi, Alex. Nice to see you. Alex used to work with us. Good to see so many of you here. Right, so thanks so much for joining. It's a pleasure to have all of you here today. Today, we're going to be focusing on gender and why gender mainstreaming is key for climate finance. Let's start with a very significant number. So starting with the COP, as the key event in our community, the number of women delegates rose from 30% in 2009 to 38% in 2021. That's an increase gained through significant efforts and specific policies. And yet, despite this, we still haven't achieved parity. But if we exclude women from the decision-making process, then are those decisions really taking into account the needs, the vulnerabilities, the different experiences of women? The same can be said about climate finance projects. We all know climate change is not gender neutral. So can we afford to have gender neutral projects? Today we'll see why not. So a little bit just about ECO. So some of you, many of you will know ECO. I think we've had a number of you at our previous webinars and training, so it's great to see you again. And for those of you who don't know ECO, ECO is an international climate finance and development consultancy, uniquely specialised in the design of low-carbon, climate-resilient projects and programmes. This year is our 23rd year, starting with our founder, Dr. Grant Ballard-Tremere, and our team of specialist consultants have been providing technical expertise to help our clients solve adaptation and mitigation challenges, devising projects that have greater impact and funding success. We provide multidisciplinary, cross-sectoral market assessments and develop strategies and formulate projects to provide long-lasting solutions for the environment and communities across Africa, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Asia. A little bit about us now. So I'm Mariella de Souza-Baker. Some of you might have seen me sending you emails or blogs and doing some of the background webinar production. So I'm based in the London office. I've worked at ECO for 5 years, and I focus a lot on our clients and partner community. I've also worked as a dissemination expert in some of our projects. And at the moment, I'm studying development at SOAS, and I've got a focus on gender. So whilst I'm at the beginning of my gender journey, so to speak, Deba and Roberta are two of our resident gender experts. So this is Debasmita Boral-Rolland, a consultant at ECO. We're really lucky to have Deba with us. She's based in Paris. She has 5 years of maybe a bit more than 5 years experience in climate finance and gender, and has designed climate finance projects for a huge range of our clients, and has secured finance from the Adaptation Fund, the GEF and the GCF. And secondly today is wonderful Roberta Piacci, our consultant at ECO. Roberta is based in Milan. She has over 9 years experience in IGOs, INGOs and the private sector. Roberta's expertise is in project design, gender mainstreaming, capacity development, and has also mobilised funds from numerous international donors. Roberta, also like Deba, has designed and delivered face-to-face and online training on project design, gender and reporting. So it's great to have both of you here as well. And I've learned so much from both of them on this journey so far. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you what we've come up with. Just a bit of housekeeping. So do feel free to participate as we go along, post all of your comments in the chat, ask all of the questions. There's a little question tab where it'll be helpful if you can write all of them in the question tab, and then upvote your favorites and we'll tackle them a little bit later on. Also, we've got a number of polls for you today, so it'd be really great to hear some of your own views on some of the questions that we ask. Right, Deba, do you want to tell us what's on the agenda?
Sure, thanks, Mariella. So very quickly today, we are reviewing some key gender concepts, busting some myths. We are also discussing why gender mainstreaming is important and why projects should respond to gendered vulnerabilities and realities of the ground. To do so, we'll introduce some key tools and trends in gender mainstreaming and climate finance. It's important to remember this is particularly from the perspective of climate finance. And then we'll explore key aspects and questions to ensure how we can mainstream gender effectively in our projects and programs.
Thanks, Deba. So gender, let's understand some of the key gender concepts. Gender, the word's often thrown around as a bit of a buzzword in the world of climate and development finance, but is very often interchangeably used to mean women and girls. So is that really what gender means? Let's bust a few myths around it.
Okay, hello everyone. Very pleased to be here and virtually meeting you all. Let's start with the first myth that we want to bust, or the first difference that is important to make, the one between gender and sex. So as you can see, by reading these two definitions that are provided by the European Institute for Gender Equality, sex has to do with biology and physical characteristics. On the other hand, gender goes beyond it. It's a lot more complex. Gender is a social construct. It implies a set of norms which are learned through socialization, and for that reason, they're time-bound and changeable. So in other words, gender determines what is expected, allowed, and valued in a woman or a man in any given context, and is part of the broader social-cultural context of any country. So what is expected of women and men in Kenya, for example, will not be the same as what is expected of them in Vietnam or in France. So gender and sex are not synonyms, and it's very important that we understand that. Because on the contrary, gender is a spectrum, and each individual can identify differently along this spectrum, including by identifying themselves differently from the sex that is assigned at birth.
Thanks, Roberta. And I think connected to this conversation is also the question of equality versus equity. So gender equality means equal rights, responsibilities, and opportunities of women and men and girls and boys, while gender equity means provision of fairness and justice in the distribution of these benefits and responsibilities between women and men. As we can see, gender equality has become a policy imperative and even something that we are pursuing as a societal norm. It's something that we are striving for in the climate change community as well. But what we really need to understand is that we do not all start at the same starting point. We have different privileges. So if you see the very interesting image that's from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, equity is sort of a way to achieve effective equality, where all can access the same services, rights, and opportunities by taking into account our individual needs and contexts. So this is a key difference also to keep in mind when we design projects, what the ambition we set for projects, which my colleague will elaborate on.
Thanks, Deba. On this note, it's very important to distinguish between gender sensitive and gender transformative. What we see quite often is these terms can be used with a great degree of flexibility, but actually they commit our projects to very different levels of ambition and intervention. You will see the picture on the slides are maybe a little odd, but it's because to explain this difference, we will be borrowing an analogy made by Professor Anita McGann, who is a professor at the University of Toronto. Professor McGann, when she speaks about the difference between incremental change versus radical or transformational change, refers to it like this. Incremental change is what you do to make the caterpillar move faster. On the other hand, transformational change is what happens when the caterpillar becomes a butterfly. Incremental change is great, but transformational change will radically change the status quo the caterpillar moves into. Something very similar can be said for the various ambitions and levels of gender mainstreaming in a project. So broadly speaking, when we opt for gender sensitive, it means that our project will be designed in a way to keep into account the differential needs, impact, and risks of our male and female beneficiaries. That the project is designed in a way that all participants can equally participate and benefit from it. On the other hand, when we design our project as gender transformative, it means that primary or one of the most important goals of that project is to challenge the systemic causes that are causing the inequality in the first place. So in the first option, we create the conditions for our caterpillar to move faster. While in the second option, we strive to contribute to change, to a change that will turn our caterpillar into butterflies. Now, of course, these are simplifications. Gender continuums are varied, they're interlinked, they have different definitions depending on the donor, the organization, or even just the gender expert who adopts them. However, as we move along and gender mainstreaming becomes the norm rather than the exception, especially in climate finance, we should remember that gender sensitive is the minimum requirement that every project, regardless of how big, how small, how the size of the budget, should always guarantee. The balance and the interest of donors and funds is edging towards gender responsive, which is when gender is not only considered, but specifically addressed, and towards gender transformative, which is what we would like to see at the end of the day.
Yeah, thanks for that, Roberta. I think, and that takes us to the conversation of, we talked about this before, gender versus sex, and my colleague also mentioned gender as a continuum. So it is important to understand that gender is not the sole marker of any individual's identity. We have to actively disregard these sort of situated identities, these constructs, or stop understanding gender itself as a binary and positing women as sort of a homogeneous group or a monolith. So there are multiple interactions between gender equality and climate change, or indeed existing gender inequality in a society that in a society and economies that are experiencing climate change. So each individual is complex and a result of a sum of stratifiers. So when we are at the intersection of these stratifiers, and we've obviously visualized a couple of them, there are many more, each of them bring a level of opportunity, but also vulnerability that exacerbate the disadvantages and inequality existing in that context. So this is what we define as intersectionality, and we possibly couldn't have given a more literal visual. It's a metaphor for understanding that there are multiple forms of inequalities or disadvantages that sometimes compound on themselves or overlap and create obstacles that are often not understood among conventional ways of thinking, or can be addressed through conventional ways of affirmative action. So the concept of intersectionality was introduced by activist and lawyer Kimberly Crenshaw when she stumbled upon the case of a Black woman who had been discriminated against in terms of hiring. The court she had appealed to found that the company had done no wrongdoing because it hired women and it hired people from the Black community. But the reality was that the company hired white women and Black men, and there was no framework to even understand the discrimination suffered by a woman of color trying to access a job that had in fact become siloed for different identities. So this is sort of a perspective to keep in mind when we design a project. So in contexts as complex as the ones that everyone that are affected by uneven shocks such as climate change, we need to adopt an intersectional approach. An example could be, for example, in Ecuador, the maternal mortality rate of indigenous women is 117 for 100,000 live births in 2018 against 57 for non-indigenous women. So when we design activities, this is one part, one data point that speaks to the broader stratified inequality that exists that we should have in mind. We have to ensure that we do not include or even worsen these factors that disadvantage indigenous women in the country, but in fact create activities that work towards unraveling some of these factors and how they impact different members of the community.
Thanks, Deba. Some great food for thought. What we're going to do now is a section which I'm excited about. So it's an empathetic take on walking her path. So we're going to explore how the concepts we've just introduced can apply at a local level. And we're going to try and do it by putting ourselves in the shoes of a woman in a rural context who will take part in a fictional climate project. Let's set the scene before we walk her path.
Thanks, Mariella. Let's see where our project and the woman we will be walking with are located. So if we look at these pretty existential questions, we are located in sub-Saharan Africa with the purpose of designing a 5-year project for a large climate fund with the focus on resilience strengthening of agripastoral communities in arid and semi-arid zones. And now let's have a look at what the projects look like.
So a pretty standard project structure. We have 3 components. So component 1 will strengthen the existing and create some further factors for sound enabling environment. So outputs under this component can include institutional strengthening, capacity building of, let's say, extension offices. Then we have component 2, which will be let's say this is an adaptation project, the adaptation investments that this project will make. So that can include construction and rehabilitation of water points, wells and boreholes in different project sites. Then the distribution of solar pumps for irrigation, which will be accessed by the community through credit schemes, and it will be a facilitated access. Then we have component 3, which will be on capacity development and monitoring, evaluation, and learning. This may include the creation of water user communities, capacity development of communities, and ensuring that the project has a monitoring and evaluation framework to ensure that the effects of the project, the impact of the project is being tracked.
Now let's meet Fatima. So we will try to walk Fatima's path to see how the project activities we saw will affect her and the other women and girls in her community.
Thanks, Mariella. So Fatima is 35 years old. She's always lived in the same rural village. So the wealth of her community be eaten away by repeated drought spells. She has 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls. They all go to school, but to do that, they need to walk 1 hour each way to reach it. Fatima's husband is a farmer, and the last few years of drought have been very difficult and challenging, and have reduced the family income. The family also owns some small livestock, mostly poultry and a few goats.
So then we sort of walk through her day. The exercise we are doing is called a time diary. Fatima wakes up before dawn to prepare food for the family. After all have eaten, she sends off the children to school and she prepares for the rest of her daily tasks. So as is expected in such a community, she is in charge of the household and childcare, which means she needs to fetch water. There are no nearby water points in the village, so she needs to walk a long distance to get there and carry heavy buckets on her way back. She also needs to fetch fuel, which means wood and biomass. And again, she has to walk and carry the fuel back home. She goes to the market if the family has enough money at that point and prepares the food on an indoor stove for each meal. She's also in charge of the family's well-being, so she finds a way to feed the family even when there are no means. At the same time, she has to clean the house and ensure she's completing other tasks which are not listed here. And this definitely sounds like a lot, but that's not all. She is also in charge of the livestock. She feeds them. She needs to ensure that they're in good health because they're intrinsically connected to the family's income and food security. She also helps her husband in the field, which can be a mix of both cash crops, but maybe primarily subsistence crops. She cares for the children. She cooks dinner, and then she cleans again. So at the end of the day, on average, she has spent almost 12 hours on paid and primarily unpaid work. So what we see is that Fatima is time poor. And this is an important consideration for project design. This concept was introduced by Elena Bardassi and Quentin Warden, who are World Bank economists, through a study in Guinea. And it's an important concept to understand. So we see that Fatima is working long hours and having no choice to do otherwise. She's time poor, she's working long hours with the combination of being monetary poor. She will also fall into further monetary poverty if she were to reduce her working hours below the time that she's already spending. So this state of being results from these two factors. And these are important considerations for project design.
So what we want to see is the project really helping Fatima. Let's zoom into the project and Fatima's life, how it intersects. The project was designed to help her community, but were her needs considered? In the next few slides, we'll present the possible consequences of having not mainstream gender into project activities, and we'll share with you a little quiz to ask what you think should have been done instead. So ready to play? I think we're going to have the polls put up on the side and we'll walk you through it. So let's start.
Sorry. Cool. Let's start with the first component, creating an enabling environment. This component is designed to create an enabling environment and ensure the proposed infrastructure and behavioral chains are long-lasting and sustainable. So as part of this, extension officers will be trained on water-saving agricultural techniques, on how to safely and efficiently operate solar water pumps and other items. The project, however, doesn't factor in training on gender rights or information about gender norms in Fatima's community. And as a result, extension officers use written manuals and outlines, but Fatima, as many older women in her village, is illiterate and has a hard time following. Meetings are held in the middle of the working day, but we just saw Fatima is time poor, so she's too busy to leave the house and attend. On the other hand, if the meeting takes place at night, it is unsafe for her and other women to walk alone back and forth. Officers have no understanding of gender rights, and therefore they end up replicating the power dynamics that exclude women from knowledge, training, and potential income opportunities. So with that in mind, we'd like to hear from you now. You can participate in the poll in the chat, which should have been put up now. So what are the things that project developers should have considered when designing this component or these activities? You can choose all the options that you'd like to between disaggregated statistics on educational resources, protection, and SGBV risks. This stands for sexual and gender-based violence risks, and gender and social norms in the community. So let's give it a few seconds. And let's have a look at the results. I see. You can choose more than one. You can choose more than one option. Let's have a look. Let's see. Quite a few answers coming in. Looks like the preferred option is gender and social norms in the communities. Okay, so what we can see from the results of this poll is that there is a majority of you that think that project developers should have considered gender and social norms in the community, which is absolutely true. And fewer of you, 16% and 6% each, which think that they should also have taken in mind disaggregated statistics on educational resources and protection and SGBV risks. Now, all these answers are correct. The reality of it is that developers should take into account all of these factors when designing a project. The social norms are essential, but we need the statistics on who owns what, on who accesses what resources. And we need always to have in the back of our mind the need and the duty to apply do no harm to all activities, to everything that we do. First and foremost, we need to protect the safety and security of all of our beneficiaries, and that includes women and girls. Okay, maybe we can move to the second component and do a similar exercise.
Yes. All right, as we had discussed before, this is the adaptation investment component. So this is where the project will make the actual investments. The designers of this component have led consultations in the community with the community leaders, so the key informants, and also in focus groups. However, they did not consider cultural norms, which restrict the freedom of women from speaking in public and contradicting their spouses or influential males or community elders in such spaces. So as a result, what happens? We see, just a second, we see that the infrastructures are built further away. They're heavy and difficult to use. So water fetching just got longer and harder for Fatima and other women in the community. The solar pumps are expensive, and the project has created a facilitated credit line for that. on paper, this looks great, but they did not consider that although money is earned by both spouses in Fatima's community, it is men who largely control family resources, and important resources, important collateral for credit lines such as land is in the name of the husband, and that women often have lower literacy and financial literacy rates. So Fatima is therefore excluded from this key decision for families' well-being, despite being in charge of primary and unpaid caregiving, domestic fuel and water provision, and food security. So what could we have done differently in this context? And that we'd like to hear from you. If you'd go to the poll, please answer. What are the actions that designers could have carried out when designing this outcome? And as with the previous one, you can choose multiple options. They could have analyzed division of labor and differential access to resources within the household. They could have led stakeholder consultations, which actively try to understand women's point of view. Participation is not equal to meaningful participation. Spoken with community leaders, designed an ad hoc credit line for women and female heads of household. So let's see what you think. Okay, a couple of seconds more. Very interesting results on this one. We have basically similar percentages. We do see a bit low on bit low on spoken with community leaders. So yeah, the first option, analyze division of labor and differential access to household resources within the household and in the community. Extremely important. And yes, this should have been done more effectively. Led stakeholder consultations. Many of you, this is at 26%. Yes, very important. And sometimes in these contexts, it is important to do segregated, may seem counterintuitive in terms of participation, but it may be very important to do a segregated focus group discussion. And this would allow you to move away from the perspective of an older influential male in the community, and then it could help give you opportunities to triangulate this data with other focus groups and other influential women leaders in the community. Designed an ad hoc credit line. Many of you have voted for this, so this is at 26%. This is a bit tricky because in the short term, they can cause backlash to women as the balance of power in the household is suddenly reversed or disturbed. This should be done keeping in mind the do no harm principle that my colleague mentioned. Awareness raising activities should accompany this, absolutely. And spoken with community leaders is now at 21%. So that is very, very true, that that we also need to ensure that key informants inform our project design. So while we do that, it needs to be done with the second option, leading inclusive stakeholder consultations. How about we move on to the next component, Roberta?
Thanks, Deba. Okay, so the third component, capacity development and MEL, which stands for monitoring, evaluation, and learning, will support the communities to efficiently and equitably use the water resources, as well as monitoring and assessing the progress achieved. But our fictional designers are still completely unaware of power dynamics in Fatima's village. And so, as a result of that, despite the fact that women are tasked to fetch water, they end up being excluded from decision-making in the water committees. So they have no power and no voice over decisions on a matter that is key to their lives, that they are tasked with and in charge of for their family's well-being. The baseline carried out to establish targets aimed for a standard 50-50 participation rate. But that really doesn't take into account the gender norms in Fatima's village and the fact that representation doesn't automatically imply participation. So in this case, to refer to one of the concepts that we have introduced at the beginning of this webinar, equality was favored over equity. There were no gender segregated focus groups during monitoring visits, so gender issues went largely unnoticed. So this is what Deba just finished to tell us. And a grievance redressal mechanism was not set up or disseminated. So women could not or did not know how to safely complain about potential physical, sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, or PSIA incidents. So another poll coming up, and would like to hear from you if you could respond to who do you think should be involved in project design. And again, you can select all that apply between no one, the designer is sufficient, a gender expert, male staff, or finance staff. Let's give it a go. Again, you can select all that apply. Okay, let's have a look at what's coming up. Just a couple more seconds. Okay, I think most people are casting their votes. Okay, looks like a gender expert is favored with 38% of votes. Then we have male staff with 31% of votes, followed closely by finance staff with 30%. And we only have 1% with one answer of someone who thinks the designer is indeed sufficient. So let's have a look at these results. They are all correct. They're all right. The thing is that we don't design projects in silos. We need to work with our colleagues, experts from other fields. But all these experts should be gender aware. Everyone, every function who plays a role in implementation needs to be involved and sensitized on gender needs, so that not only we have that level of commitment at the beginning of the process of the cycle, of the project cycles, when we design the project, but also when then we need to implement, evaluate, assess, monitor the project. We need to have our gender lens, our gender glasses on, to make sure we always have that level of understanding, that level of commitment in mind. And that cannot be done by the gender expert alone. That cannot be done by the designer alone. It needs some level of commitment. It needs some level of cooperation and collaboration from all the other functions that usually come up to co-design a project, and in this case, specifically a climate finance project. Okay, I think we can move to the next section.
Thanks, Roberta. So now we've seen a case of a project that was completely gender neutral. The reality, fortunately, is that most projects will have some level of gender awareness, but might have some gaps as the ones which we saw just now. So what can we do to avoid them, and what can we do to ensure effective gender mainstreaming?
Thanks, Mariella. So we'll just cover some important tools and resources in this section, with the caveat that this is not an exhaustive list. It's the first thing you need to develop to ensure that you actually mainstream gender in your projects and programs, and is now practically mandatory from all donors and climate funds, is a gender assessment. So here on the slide, you can see the main questions you may want to raise when you develop your assessment. sort of helps you unpack the gender construct and look at the different intersecting factors. So the first question is, what is the gender and socioeconomic context for the proposed project intervention? The answer to which should ideally include the information on demographic data disaggregated by sex and income, main sources of income for men in the community, for women in the community, impacts of climate change on men and women, boys and girls, overview of some common gender beliefs, values, and practices. The second question would be a question that relates to resources. So who has what in the project site, in the project area? This can cover land, resources, income, assets. You also need to understand how these resources are gender disaggregated through this question, including who controls access to our own land, water, energy, what is the extent of access to education and information, financial and essential economic activities and services. The third question, which is very important, is who does what in the project area? What are sort of the gendered roles and responsibilities? This definitely connects to the time poverty conversation we had earlier. Through this question, you have to ask what gendered roles and responsibilities are also in the formal and informal economy, and you need to understand who is also in charge of decision-making in the political, economic, and social spheres, in the community, and also in the household. And it relates to the fourth question: who decides what in the household and the community? So this has two aspects. What are the levels of representation in governance structures? Can every individual voice their needs and opinions? And then how is also power distributed and who gets to make these decisions? Using these questions, you sort of set your context, and you need to understand then the implication of climate change, which often has uneven shocks, depending on the context it's functioning in, on men, women, boys and girls, and how then we can design projects and plan project interventions in consideration of these questions. Additionally, through this gender assessment, you need to show how gender inequality, specific vulnerabilities, and gender-sensitive needs will be addressed by the project and demonstrate specific strategies for each target group. Now we'll go through a basic structure of a gender assessment. So ideally, you introduce your area of climate investment, what are the current gender mainstreaming activities, and your ambition for the project. And by ambition, I mean, we go back to the conversation of whether you're designing a gender-sensitive project, a gender-responsive project, or a gender-transformative project. It is very important to also have a good baseline understanding of the national policies, legal and institutional frameworks and strategies that affect gender inequality in this context. More and more national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions are beginning to include gender provisions as well. So it is important to include this here as well. The gender context analysis, as mentioned, is a non-exhaustive list. So you can build this by answering the previous questions, adding in national statistics and composite indices, regional and subnational statistics focusing on your area of intervention, information and discussion on subsections such as representation, voice, power distribution, and decision-making, control of productive resources, income gaps and land rights, roles and responsibility, access to finance and financial literacy, access to energy, access to water resources, and then following up with conclusion and recommendations for the program. We will briefly also sort of look at a list of helpful sources. Again, there is a wealth of information out there. These are just some of the secondary sources you can refer to for setting the context for your gender assessment. And ideally, you should fill the gaps of this review with primary data collection through inclusive stakeholder consultations and other methodologies, and also triangulate your findings. So you have some UN agencies who are dedicated to certain adaptation and mitigation type work. For example, if you want to look at the agriculture and gender assessments on agriculture. FAO is a good source point. Composite indices such as the Human Development Index, the GGI, the Gender Inequality Index, the Multidimensional Poverty Index are very important. The World Bank has a dedicated gender data portal with topic-specific indicators. The national statistics agencies of each country will also have census and household data that is very important. International and local NGOs often have one-off studies or monographs on specific areas of a country, which are very useful as well.
Thank you very much, Deba. And moving on, in terms of tools and resources, let's have a very quick look at the Gender Action Plan, which is always also something that is more and more required when you develop a climate finance project. So the Gender Action Plan is a tool to show how gender is mainstreamed across the project design and its implementation. It presents a description of gender sensitive or responsive or transformative, depending on the level of ambition of your project, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact, therefore your logic chain, the targets and indicators that are included in the project to address the gender concerns, and the mechanisms to ensure implementation of the gender design elements, the responsibilities, the timelines, and any associated costs or resources that are required. So the GAP is a tool that is used to ensure that the gender component is actually mainstreamed. It may be a tool quite often to encourage women's empowerment through the project or the program design. And it features, it includes the targets, the design features, the performance indicators that are designed to ensure the equitable participation and equitable share of benefits for men, women, girls, and boys. If we look at how it actually looks like, we can see that it is a tool to link the log frame with the gender entry point for each relevant activity, output, and an outcome. So if we go through this example, which is an actual example of a GCF-funded project, we can see this is built to identify gender action points in the project activities. And by embedding gender action points in project activities, it becomes a lot easier to develop gender sensitive or gender responsive or gender transformative indicators and targets. It's important to understand that and the action plan, the gender action plan, is not a separate component from the log frame. This example, where we also have the responsible party, the means of verification, how these indicators are monitored, it shows how integrated the gender action plan and the log frame should be. So one cannot exist without the other. And that's why they should be developed jointly and ideally along with the stakeholder engagement plan, which is the third piece of the puzzle that ensures you have an inclusive project, that ensures you have spoken with the communities of concern, that you have that inclusive consultations with all the caveats that we have seen before. So I guess we can move on, maybe have a look at final reflection points.
Yeah, thanks so much, Roberta and Deba. That was truly fascinating. For all of you who have joined us, we've come to the end of our gender webinar. We've understood some key terminology and concepts and discussed the consequences on people's lives when we fail to consider gender considerations in project design, and walk through some key tools and resources you'll need to develop. I think Debbie gave us a great list there, the tools that you need to develop for basically all climate finance projects. So now it's time to go through some final reflection points and questions you might want to ask yourself or your organisation the next time that you develop a project. So a few questions to ask yourself, which we've come up with. So firstly, how are project participants distributed in the project area and disaggregated? So in other words, what does my target population look like? How many women and girls are there? And without knowing that, we can't even start thinking about a project idea, design idea.
Thanks, Mariella. The second question you may want to ask yourself is, what are the sociocultural norms shaping the division of power and resources in the participating communities, and how is it gendered? So understanding the dynamics of communities you are targeting will help you design better projects. So for example, it will prevent you from rehabilitating a well that was working poorly, but allowed women to congregate outside of the village to fetch water, providing an invaluable moment of sharing and networking. The third question is, does my team have internal gender expertise? Some of the items we saw today, including applying a gender lens, collecting secondary and primary data, require some level of expertise. Before embarking into a project design process, it would be worth asking yourself whether your team has that expertise internally, or if external resources are indeed required.
And that obviously leads to the question of what resources do you need to build into the project's budget to ensure that it is gender responsive. So if I can quote one of the greatest philosophers of our time, Tom Cruise, show me the money. You will need resources to develop the project, but to ensure that you can implement your gap, funds and resources will have to be built into the project budget. That could mean potentially many things, which could be a full-time gender expert for the duration of the project, to possibly include staff training, to conduct ad hoc gender activities, to also using some of that resources for specific procurement. As I mentioned, the possibilities are endless, but what is certain is that if funds are not included in the budget, then the project will definitely fall short of its gender outcomes. I think it's also worth mentioning that with the different climate funds now, once you do a gender assessment and an action plan, you have to indicate these targeted budget lines as well. And the last question you must ask yourself is, how can I go beyond the 50-50 target and actually ensure meaningful metrics and indicators? So this is a key point, and this is one that we sort of saw earlier walking through Fatima's day. Is representation the same thing as participation? No, just like diversity is not the same thing as inclusion. Just because one group is represented in an activity, it doesn't mean they actually have a choice or a chance to meaningfully participate in it. So it is essential to understand the project context to provide realistic indicators for your gender entry points. And sometimes the targets may be below the 50-50 split, simply because there won't be enough women to comply with that. But there is also, in this situation, an opportunity. If there are not enough women working on the processing side of a value chain, what could we do, for example, to promote their involvement? And how could that lead to increased economic empowerment? On the other hand, sometimes you may want to, or in fact need to, prioritize women and have 60 or 40 or 70 or 30 participation splits in their favor. For example, if you were working on the shea butter value chain in Ghana, where most producers are women, and this would simply follow an equity logic, because through your analysis, you will have identified a disadvantage that is not rectified simply by allocating equal room. It cannot be 50-50 to male and female participants, but in fact, you will need to, in this context, favor women over men.
Thanks so much, Deba. We have a little bit of time for some questions, and so I'm just going to go to the questions tab now, and I'll throw it out to both of you, Deba and Roberta. You can answer. So should we see? Let's just go down. So, okay. So we've got one from Alex. Let's go down. So it's a great point that gender experts must be involved in the whole project cycle. So when designing terms of reference for a gender expert, what are important factors to consider and include?
That is a very good question. Thank you very much, Alex, for asking that. Well, off the top of my head, in most cases, with climate finance projects, we do end up having some requirements from the fund itself for the specific project, or from the client for any specific project. So it's good to go along, of course, with those requirements. But I would say it's also important to work with national or local consultants that have an understanding of the context, of the language, that can, in most cases, bring an additional level of understanding and really make it so that the gender mainstreaming process is a lot more localized. Deba, do you have any other comments?
Yeah, in terms, those are very key points to remember. And then when you're looking at a TOR in terms of weightage, I think it's also important to understand that the dedicated person is not going to be able to cover everything related to gender. And when we design a TOR like that, what happens is gender becomes one person's problem in the project management unit, and we definitely want to avoid that. So I think having some level of training for the PMU programmed into the TOR for the gender expert is very important, so that not only the gender expert, but then very key people, an MEL expert, the knowledge management and applied learning expert, they are all working sort of in tandem to deliver on the results. I think that is also a key aspect to remember.
So a collaborative effort. Right, so we've got a question from Sylvia here. So what are some recommendations for establishing credible and achievable targets whilst also being transformative? Thank you, Sylvia.
I think we were talking about this. I think that was the very last point we discussed. I think this has to be very much drawn from your assessment. And if you are designing an activity where you expect that women participate more, you definitely need to make the case for that, not only through the gender assessment, but in your funding proposal or other such very centerpiece documents, the feasibility studies, and then have that sort of an indicator. If in the case you are focusing on a value chain where men might be more active, it is normal that you might have more men as your beneficiary, but at the same time, then use the opportunity to understand how women are involved, say in post-harvest activities, etc., to make sure you're having a holistic effect through your project. Roberta, do you want to add something to that?
I completely agree, and maybe to contribute to that, just that every gap is an opportunity for the project to find another entry point and support women empowerment in a given sector, but also in terms of transformational power. Every project has the potential of being transformative, of course, but then large-scale transformational change is something that needs to happen in collaboration with other projects, with other programs, with other initiatives. So I would say it's also a good point to see what other projects, other partners are doing in that sector, in that region, and see how we can complement, how we can build on that and multiply the benefits of the existing projects without overlapping.
Thanks, Roberta. We've got a couple more minutes and we've just got a really small exercise after this. I think we'll answer the 2 questions that we have up here and then we'll move on to the quick exercise we have. So if you've got a few more minutes, that'd be great if you stuck with us, but don't worry if you have to head off. There's one from Caroline here. So if the climate funds do not provide for long-term transformative change, time and resources, is downgrading your ambition to gender responsive is the only option? What do you both think?
So Caroline, what you're asking is whether a project can be transformative even with a smaller budget and less time. So let's say 24 months rather than 5 years. I do not necessarily think it's it's a matter of resources and it's a matter of time. It's more a matter of what is the primary focus of your project. In order for the project to be considered as gender transformative, it really needs to want to challenge the existing causes of inequality. And yes, of course, this is generally a longer term process, but it can focus on something very specific and it can be transformative even in a shorter amount of time. Downgrading the ambition from gender transformative to gender responsive is still a very good point. It's a very good place for your project to be. So I think the question is more about what is the ambition of the project rather than how many resources do I have. I don't know, Deba, if you agree.
Yes, I totally agree. And if you are faced with a limited pot of money, which you will be as a project designer, I think a question sort of you and your institution to ask is, are we going to do many things which are gender sensitive, or are we going to do a couple of things which are gender responsive or targeted thing that is gender transformative? And at the same time, we are talking about climate finance. So the first aspect of it is adaptation, mitigation, or cross-cutting. And from there, within that, you're programming in gender. So you may want to, as Roberta mentioned for the previous question, see what are the sort of other activities in terms of gender going on, and then how can you sort of add that sort of top up using or benefit from that existing level of investment and activities that are on as well, which could be very helpful if you want to have an impact, but you are strapped or really strapped in this occasion.
Thanks very much. And we've got the final question from Mariella Boral-Rolland, which I think is a familiar name. So Emil's asking, how do you address in project design the trade-off between ensuring greater gender inclusion and the risk of backlash that this creates? This is particularly relevant in certain contexts where exclusionary social practices and norms are common and could affect long-term project sustainability. Deborah, do you want to field that?
Yeah, sure. I think to begin with, this is a question. This is, of course, a question of do no harm. I think there have been many examples of projects where, and I think we discussed this before, creating, for example, ad hoc female access credit line can change the household power dynamics, and that can create backlash. In this situation, I think you definitely want to be, first of all, within your gender assessment, and this is also, again, something that is becoming progressively important for different climate funds, ensuring that you're doing a gender-based violence risk analysis and programming the mitigation plan of those gender-based violence risks into your environmental and social action plan or environmental and social management frameworks, and then having some dedicated activities that may support you rolling out such a resource. For example, ensuring that you're creating allies within the community, sensitization workshops. Roberta, would you like to add something to this?
No, I think it's what you said is spot on. It's very important to have allies in the community, and it's also very important that gender work is not siloed or thought as a women's matter. It needs to be very clear to the communities where we work in that from gender work we have community-wide benefits. And on this note, before you go, we'd like to do a little bit of word cloud, or build our own word cloud. So if in the chat, as a last gift to us, you could describe with a word or an expression the key takeaway that you got from this webinar. And we really will treasure this feedback and use it to further improve our trainings and webinars in the future. So let's have a look. To those of you who are kindly still with us, how would you describe with a word, with a phrase, with an expression, the main takeaway from this webinar. Let's give it a few seconds.
And while you're adding them, I just wanted to say thank you to each of you for attending, and we really hope that you found this session valuable. So if you have any questions on gender considerations and project design, do feel free to get in touch. Roberta's here, Deba's here, and we've got a number of our team who are very well versed in gender as well. And if you're particularly interested in undertaking a specific training on gender, we're constantly doing them globally, internationally, for small groups and big groups. So do feel free to get in touch if you're interested in that, and we'll tailor something specifically to your needs. Our team has significant experience in gender mainstreaming for project design, but also in designing gender approaches for larger programs and integrating gender also into business practices. We've just also signed up to the UN Global Women's Compact agreement, which Rowan Putman, our new managing director, has signed us up to. So we've got all of these thoughts on gender, and we've got experience. So do feel free, whether it's for a coffee, a chat, or a training that you'd be interested in. But for now, with my marketing hat on, please follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. So many of you do already and engage, which is fantastic. We're always putting up invitations, we're always putting up lots of blogs at the moment. Deba, Roberta, also Jack, our marketing assistant, he's written wonderful blogs on gender, which would be great to hear any thoughts on. Thank you, Jack, also for helping produce this today. We'll be sending out the replay kit to all of you and the registrants with the slides and the recording. I know a number of you have asked. And if you have any questions, if you just want to say hi, we'd love to hear from you as always. So thanks so much, Deba. Thanks so much, Roberta. It's been wonderful to speak to you today.
Thank you very much to Mariella, to Jack, to our marketing team, and of course to all of our wonderful participants. Thank you for being so engaged. Thank you for participating so much. And thanks also for engaging and indulging us into our last exercise. Many wonderful feedback here that we will really be treasuring. Thank you very much.
Thank you.